It is Monday at 7 o'clock, so that means it's time to model some parts in Fusion 360 here at the Milwaukee Makerspace. And if you're joining us from your own personal makerspaces at your house, you can. It's that time for you too. All right, so we've been drawing these vintage-inspired radios. This will be the last of this series where we are going to draw the fronts for our radios and then be done with it and move on to another project. After 5 parts, it's time to do that. So without further ado, let's just kind of jump in and refresh ourselves, because we took a week off because I had a little because I was traveling. So here's where we were at with our vintage inspired radios. We got our batteries and our speakers, and this is our dials here for the radio. Now we just need a front cover. So let's do that. And I think my method here for making the front cover is I think I'm going to make this a separate component, just because we've kind of got a lot of separate components going on here. Anyway, our battery is a separate component, our speaker is a separate component, our helical gears are separate components for our dials. So let's go ahead and make this a separate component as well. And the way that we do that is just by creating a new component from our create menu. So I'm going to come over here to create, and then come down to the first option right at the top is a new component. So a component is a collection of bodies and sketches and I guess construction planes and joints and all sorts of stuff. So all that goes inside of each individual component. So when I click on this new component option here, we can name our component, and the name of this I'm going to call the front, because it's going to be the front of our radio, or the front cover, I suppose you can think about it too as that. And we're going to make it an internal component, meaning it's going to be created inside of this main document component here.
Be careful.
It's worth noting that as I'm making this new component, I've got my main document component here highlighted. So I'm going to make this new document, or this new component, inside of this vintage radio from class component here. Now, if your little radio button that's next to that component was highlighted on one of these components down here, we would make this component inside of one of these components, and we do not want to do that, just for the sake of organization. So now that we've got that straightened out, I'm just going to say OK. So now we can see that because we've made a new component, we've kind of switched our, I wish I knew that, the active component, we've switched that to be this component that we just created here. So the little radio button next to the component tells us which component is active. And you can kind of see visually out here, I just changed it to this helical gear. So now we can see this helical gear is kind of the only thing that's not ghosted out here. So you can kind of see visually which component you have active as well. And that's something we'll want to keep in mind as we're doing this. So from here on out, or probably from most of this on out here, we're going to be making sure that our front component is the active component. Alright, and now that we've got our front component created, we can make a sketch. So we do that the same way we always do, just by coming up to the create menu and then choosing the create sketch option. So this create sketch option will allow us to take some geometry that we've already got and bring it into this component. So I'm going to create this component on one of these front faces of my radio. So if I kind of spin this around, we can kind of see this is the face that I want. Any one of these faces that is kind of the front edge, I guess we could say, of our curve cut body. Any one of these faces will do. So I'm just going to click on this one up here at the top in the front, and then I'll spin so I'm looking straight at my radio. And this is convenient because we've got kind of all the parts in here that we're going to want to have access to on the front of our radio. So firstly, the outside edge, we're going to want to not have to redraw this curve, and we can just go ahead and pull in this already drawn geometry from the other components onto this sketch. And the way that we do that is with the project tool. So if I come down here to create and then project, and then I scroll over to this project option, what this project option allows us to do is to project the body or silhouette of edges from geometry that already exists here. So if I choose this project option, I got my little project window over here, and I could just go ahead and start hovering over stuff. If I start hovering over things, you can see it highlights red or black in some cases. So if I hover over a body here, it's kind of highlighting. If I change my selection filter to bodies, it kind of highlights all the edges of that body. I do indeed want to leave my selection filter on what's known as specified entities, though, because initially when we were doing this, I modeled all these curve cuts in here. This was kind of overkill, and it makes us have to do a little bit of work now after the fact. So if I just kind of hover over these edges, in fact, you know what? Actually, if I change my selection type to bodies, oh yeah, look at that, that's convenient. So if I change my selection type to bodies, you can see any body that I hover over will highlight fully red. If I hover over kind of this empty space here, this body that's highlighting right now, this is actually the back of my radio. And conveniently, the back and the front are exactly the same. And that's the exact geometry that I'm looking for, is just that outer edge. I just need to see that outer edge of the radio, and so we can just click on that, and then we've got one item selected here in our geometry section in the project window, and I can just say OK. So that's the first thing we need to do. The next thing we need to do is let's create some openings around where our speaker is. So if the sound of our radio is going to be heard, we're going to need some sort of opening here. And we can do this in a number of different ways. So my first method, let's go with lines for the first method. So I'm going to start by creating a circle, and I'm going to make that circle exist right where my speaker exists. Tell you what, let's project our speaker as well, just so we've got that information in front of us. Unless I want to make it visually bigger than that. Let's go ahead and draw a new circle. So I'm going to come up here to my Create menu, and I'm going to choose Circle, and then Center Diameter Circle here. And now I'm going to click somewhere near the center of my speaker, wherever my speaker exists on your design. And I'm just going to make this a little bit bigger than that. This is something that is kind of a visual thing, so I leave it up to your own discretion if you want to make it a little bit smaller or a little bit bigger. But I'd like to see my slits on my speaker take up almost the whole front of my radio. And I'll just kind of move this into place where I think it'll look good on the front of my radio here. That seems like a good spot to me. Now, inside of this circle, I want to create a series of slits, kind of just like as openings in the front of this radio, right? So I'm going to grab my line tool. I'll come up here to create, and then line, and I'm going to choose to make this line right across the middle of my circle. So if I click and place the first point on one side of my circle, and then click and place the second point on the other side of my circle, now I've got a line that divides that right in half. And this line, it goes right through the center of my circle here. So one way that you could do this, in fact, we're going to use a lot of constraints here coming up. So if we wanted to make this line using constraints, so if I drew my line right across like this, and now I'm way off, I could first tell this line that I want it to be straight horizontal. So we've got a constraint called the horizontal vertical constraint. And if I choose that and then specify that line that I poorly drew, then it makes that line perfectly horizontal. However, it's not in the middle. So I can do one more constraint. If I add this coincident constraint here, what this coincident constraint will do is it will say, hey, take this line and make sure it's coincident with the center of that circle. So that's one way to add some constraints to move your line in place. And now the next thing we want to do here is to make a pattern of that line. So if I come up here to my Create menu, and I come down to Rectangular Pattern, the object that I'm going to make a pattern of is our center line there. And then I'm just going to take this arrow and I'm going to move it up so I can see this kind of visually in front of me here. Now, I always encourage people to, when they see numbers, they should type numbers. But in this case, it's handy to be able to get a visual representation of what's going on here. So I can never tell which direction is which. So we've got one direction here, and then we've got a second direction here. And in order to know which I'm controlling, I kind of have to move this arrow up, and now I can see, all right, this is this second direction option here. Because I'm actually not making a rectangular pattern, I'm making like a linear pattern. And so we can choose to make a pattern in just one direction. We don't have to make a pattern in both directions. In fact, I can change this other direction to 0? Nope, it's got to be something. Alright. And now, instead of a distance type here that is set to extent, I'm going to change that to spacing. Because I want to set the space in between my lines to be 1/4 of an inch. So, and instead of doing this in just one direction, I want to do it symmetrically. So what that'll do is every time I up my quantity here, it'll add 1 to each side. And I can just go ahead and add those in until I run out of space on my circle. So I just need to extend out to the edges of my circle here and fill up the interior space there with lines, with this pattern of a vertical line, horizontal line. For me that was 19. For you it might be different depending on how big your the circle you drew here in front of your speaker. And then I'm going to go ahead and click on OK. So this would be a phenomenally adequate way to make holes in the front of our radio for our speaker to be heard. However, I don't really like the way this edge looks. So instead of these corners at each edge, I'd like to see a nice circular edge, nice, like it's made by a cutting tool, like it's made by a mill. So I'm going to go ahead and add those into my design here. So I'm going to zoom in a little bit so I can see this a little bit bigger. And I'm going to start adding those circles to the edge. And I'm going to do that by choosing a circle option that we don't use a whole lot. There is this circle. I think we can make this circle a 3-tangent circle. So this is one of those rare occasions where a 3-tangent circle will come in real handy. In fact, let me just go ahead and try it just ahead of you and make sure that it does work like I think it does. Ooh, and it does not. It won't let us make it tangent to a circle. Alright, so let's choose, instead of that 3-tangent circle, let's try a 2-tangent circle. So if we choose that 2-tangent circle, and now we choose each of our lines, and now I kind of just like place this circle somewhere in between that. Now if I zoom in, I believe now it should let me add a 3rd constraint. So I've got my 2-tangent circle that I added, and now if I want this circle to line up or to be tangent to my larger circle, I can add an additional tangent constraint between that circle and this circle. Well, that's one way of doing it. It kind of shrunk my circle in, but that's okay. That's one way of skinning a cat, I guess. You know, and I probably did that because my circle doesn't really have a dimension. So if I want to make sure that whatever constraint that I add here now in the future, it doesn't affect the diameter of this larger circle, I should give it, I should constrain its dimension. And I think I'm going to go ahead and do that right now. So from the Create menu, I'm going to go ahead and choose this Sketch Dimension option. And if I choose this larger circle as the object that I want to give a dimension to, I can just place that dimension somewhere. It doesn't really even need to be changed at this point. Like, this is a visual thing for me. I just want my circle to be that size. So sure, 4.72189 whatever is fine. And now if I add that coincident constraint, I'm sorry, that actually that might work as well. Coincident constraint. If I add this tangent constraint between this small circle and this larger circle, then it didn't affect the size of my circle. It did still move it a little bit, but that's because it's not, my larger circle is not constrained in place. So we'll just let that fly for now. So now I want to do that a whole bunch more times. This is where I say making stuff is mostly sanding, because we need to add this small circle to every other space here. So I'm going to do this a bunch of times. You'll get to see me get real good, and you as well, I think, will get real good at making the circles. I will say though, we only need to add them to half, to one side of our piece, because we can use the mirror command to mirror them over our circle and make the other side of them. So I really just need to do either the right side or the left side. No need to do any more work than is necessary. We're lazy makers. Alright, so 2-tangent circle, pick my 2 lines, and then place my circle in there, and then I'll go and add my tangent constraint that constrains it to be near that outside edge. Let's do that a couple more times. 2 tangent circle. There we go, and we'll add our tangent constraint. I can always move my circle back after the fact here. Tangent circle again. This is where like keyboard shortcuts would really be handy, and I might think about doing that if I was just sitting at home drawing this. I might go, hey, if I gotta do this 14 times, this 2 tangent circle here, if I just click on the little three dots next to that, I could either say pin it to the toolbar, and that might be just as useful right now. So I could take this, and now I've got my 2 tangent circle as an icon right up here. And the same for my tangent constraint. So I could take that tangent constraint and say pin it to the toolbar. And now I've got access to those tools much easier. They're not buried in a menu. Just a couple more down here at the bottom. Mike, how you doing? Are you adding some circles?
I'm playing with a different pattern, but yeah.
Okay, cool.
I'm adding a shitload of little circles.
Yeah,
here.
you could do like a pattern and an array of just dots.
Doing a rectangular pattern, a 1/4-inch circle.
Nice. All right, cool. Yeah, I always encourage people like, hey man, don't make my radio, make your radio. So you know, if you can if some of these techniques that we're kind of going through help you to figure out how to make the radio that you want to make, or make whatever the project is that you want to make, then that's awesome. You could also think about like making a radial pattern. So you could take your whole pattern and make it a round pattern as opposed to a square pattern. That could be fun and interesting. But again, don't make my radio, make your radio, man. Alright, so now I just have to mirror. I just need a line to mirror around. So I'm just going to kind of draw in a vertical line there. And this vertical line, I'm going to go ahead and turn that into a construction line. So I do that by hitting the X key, or in my line type or my sketch palette, I can change the line type from solid to like this dashed line by just choosing this construction option. And the reason I have chosen to do that is because I want to create a mirror. So if I click on create and then mirror, and we choose each one of those circles that we meticulously drew with all those tangent constraints in there. And now I select my mirror line. For some reason I got 10 selected, and I don't think I wanted to. It's always an interesting thing. A circle is actually two different things you can mirror. You can mirror the center of the circle, or you can mirror the outside of the circle. And I often will accidentally click on the center of it, and then I'll only end up with a single point that I mirror, or do something to, instead of the ring of the circle, which is, you know, the useful part most of the time. Alright, so now Now I've got those speaker slits made. Let's go ahead and extrude this. So let's kind of make this a physical front at this point. So I'm going to go ahead and say Finish Sketch. And now if I come over to my Extrude option from the Create menu, so I'll go ahead and click on Create, and then come down to Extrude. And I'm going to go ahead and choose everything except for those circular bits that those circular slots that I was making. So that's going to involve me kind of zooming in here on these lower pieces quite a bit, because there's probably a way we could have drawn this where instead of making a full circle for this piece, we could have just used like an arc tool to just draw half of that circle. But I didn't do that. So you can't either, because those are the rules. Alright, I just gotta zoom way in there so I make sure I get all the little kibbles and bits that are part of these tangent circles. I do a lot of like zooming in and zooming out, because I just use a trackpad. Most people, I'm sure, when they're using Fusion, they've got their fancy 16-button mouse out, and they're using all 15 of the buttons that they can possibly use on their mouse. But I'm a minimalist, man. I just need one button. That's all I need. One button and a control key. Alright. So now you can kind of start to see what the face of the radio is going to look like here. So if I rotate this, so a little bit more of a isometric view there, and I expand this out like 0.25 inches, like 1/4 of an inch or so. I think that's about how thick my radio front is. And I'm making this a new body, and then I'm just going to say OK. Cool. So now we can kind of start to get a feel for what the front of our, here I'm going to turn, we got a sketch to name first of all. This is the front. So there's that sketch is named, and we've got a body to name in our bodies folder. This is also called the front cover. Anything is better than body one. If I turn my sketch off, I can get a really good look at that. Alright, so we're moving in the right direction here. The next thing that we need to have on the front of our radio are our dial and our knob. So if I come back to this sketch, this front sketch, and I right click on it and I say Edit Sketch, now I'll kind of go back in time to when I was making this sketch. So I don't have my extrusion anymore. In fact, it's down here in my timeline at the bottom of my Fusion window. I see my timeline here. Here's the sketch, and then this extrusion is grayed out because we're kind of back in time before we made it. And now I can project my dial. You know, I think I actually kind of want to move my dial. I wonder if there's space to move my dial. I think there certainly is. So I've got a knob down here, and I've got a dial indicator right up here. And I think I'd like to move that in so it exists a little bit more out here near the closer to the middle of my radio. So in order to do that, I'm pretty sure I can move something while I'm editing a sketch. These are famous last words, but if I come down here to move copy, sure can't. Okay, so it only lets me move a sketch object right now, so I'm actually going to have to say finish sketch, and then I'm just going to turn off this body, my body that is my front cover. Only now when I go back in time to edit that sketch, it would be before the move. So I'm going to have to come back in time before I made the sketch. So if I were to move this item now, where I am currently in the timeline, when I go back and edit this sketch, it will not be moved yet. So I have to come back in time to before when I made that first sketch. So down at the bottom, I'm just dragging this little playhead of my timeline down to before I made this sketch. And now if I come up here to this move option, so in the modify menu and choose move, I'm going to choose both of my, and I don't want to move a body, I want to move a component. And I can choose both of my helical gears. So one is my dial and one is my knob. And now I can move those. Oh, it doesn't even want to let me move those because we've got a joint holding them together. So we probably made our joint prematurely. I'm going to verify that this is why it's not working. So if I take these joints here that we made in the last class, can I just suppress them? Does that work? If I suppress them, can I move them? Nope. So I'm actually going to have to delete these joints, unfortunately. Because one of these joints is it's a rigid joint, so it's a joint between one of these dials and the body itself, and my radio body itself. And because that joint exists, at least I'm pretty sure why that's why it wouldn't let me do it. I have to delete that joint, and now if I say move copy and change this to components, now it will let me move these anywhere I want to. And it's because I had a joint linking one of these components to the radio body itself, because one of the joints was a rigid joint, and that was keeping me from moving those to the place to wherever I wanted to. So this is why I tell people, like, oh, you just got to draw it right the first time. So you don't have to move things around, but that's not how my brain hole works. So I often find myself doing this. Alright, so now I can position that in a little bit better place, and then I can say OK. And now, after I move something, and I've gone back in time to do this, this is an important step. So up here in the top right hand corner, I've got this capture position option here, this little icon, and if I choose to capture that position, now it won't try to move it when I go into the future. Sometimes that's the thing that happens. Alright, so now I can right click on this sketch and I can say edit sketch. And now this dial and this knob, I want to project where the center point of that is. So if I come up here to my create menu and I choose this project option again, so just like we projected the edges of our radio, if I choose this project option and then I zoom in, let me choose you. Oh, I've got body selected. So I just need the center point of that knob, or what will be the knob down there. And then I don't think it'll let me pick a center point for this gear. That is my... Is it that gear? No, it's this gear right here. But I wonder if there's a sketch that's turned off. There's not. So I'm just going to have to go ahead and project this whole gear, I guess. Because once that whole gear is projected, yeah, so as soon as that gear was projected, it was like, hey, look, there's some curves there. There's a circle, and I know where the center of that is, and just gave it to me, which is a wonderful thing. So I just need these two center points, because we need a hole in the front of our radio for each of those things. So I'm going to go ahead and create a circle that is at the same center point as our dial, because our dial is going to come poking out a hole that is about 1/4 of an inch big. So we're going to have a hole in the front of our radio that our dial pokes out of. And then second, we're going to have a dial. So I'm going to go ahead and draw another circle. And this circle I'm going to make 1 inch. Seems like a nice size dial for the outside edges of our dial here. And then I'm just going to go ahead and hit enter. Now I'm going to do a similar operation up here for, I'm sorry, this is the knob. The dial is up here. And our dial is also going to have a shaft of some sort that pokes out the center of it. So let's make that 1/4 of an inch as well. Just a little 1/4 inch hole in our in the face of our radio here. And now something we didn't get around to in the last class was to make the little indicator to show where this dial is pointing to. So if I come up here and let's make one more circle, we'll make this circle just a little bit less than 1/4 of an inch. Actually, you know what, let's do this. That first circle we made, let's make it a little bit bigger than 1/4 of an inch. So I changed mine to 0.27. And now we can make a circle inside of that circle that is 1/4 of an inch. And that'll fit nicely inside of there. So now we got two circles, one that's 1/4 of an inch and one that's 0.27 inches. And if I zoom in to that circle so I can differentiate between the two of them, and I'm going to make a line that is tangent to this smaller circle. In fact, let me zoom way in so we can see this real nicely. So I want to make a line that's tangent to this inner circle. And I know a fun shortcut. If I hold down my shift key before I start making my line, so now I'm still holding my shift key and I'm clicking to place the first point of my line. Now while I hold this shift key, this line is just going to maintain its tangency to that smaller 1/4 inch circle. So I'm just going to drag this out somewhere in this area over here. And then I'm going to click and place that point. So I get the beginnings of like a little arrow that's going to point outward here. I'm going to draw another line, and this line is going to be just to mirror a shape over, because I'd like to have another line that comes from the bottom of this circle is also tangent to it and comes out the same distance at the same angle. And instead of struggling to try to make that line, I'm going to draw a mirror line. So I'm just going to draw a line straight out from the center of my circle. Just a short little distance, doesn't need to be anything specific. And I'm going to again change this line to a construction line. So I'm going to click on it and change it to a construction line. And now I've got this dashed line that I can mirror this first line over. So if I click on Create and then Mirror, I'm going to choose that line there, and then I'm going to choose my mirror line to mirror over, and I'll say OK. So now I've got these two identical angled lines here, and now I'm going to use my circle tangent trick again, just like I made all the tangent circles over here at for the cutout of my speaker holes here. I'm going to use that same tangent trick to kind of close off the end of my dial indicator, let's call it. So I'll go ahead and use my two tangent circle icon that I created for myself. I'll specify each one of my lines, and then I'll just kind of place this out here near the end. And now we've got our indicator drawn. Alright, so I'm going to go ahead and say Finish Sketch. And now we can extrude these items as well. So I'm back in the present where I've got my extruded item here. Now, one thing we can do here is we can edit our extrusion. I guess there are two ways we can do this, right? So we could do another, because we need to have holes here. We need to have holes where our knob and our dial are going to pop out. And the two ways that we can do that are, we could say, hey, let's make a new extrusion, and let's choose both of those circles, and we'll extrude them out and cut through this front face, right? And here I'll just kind of illustrate that just so you can kind of see what I'm talking about. So I'm going to choose these two circles, and I'm going to extrude them out, right? Now we're cutting out those two circles from our front face. So that's one way of doing it. The other way of doing it is I can just edit this first extrusion. So this extrude down here in my timeline, I can right click on that and say Edit Feature. So now, instead of kind of doing a secondary extrusion where we cut out these holes, I just have to remove the holes from the extrude that I'm currently making. So if I just remove those two holes there, then I can say OK, and I can hide this sketch just so it makes this a little bit easier to look at. So now we have less extrusion icons that are happening down here. Maybe that's a good thing. It's easier to read this the less objects there are down here in the bottom of our little parametric timeline. Alright, so let's make our knob. So if I go back to our front here, and something you saw me do in that last bit is I'd like to extrude out this knob shape that we made. However, I can't seem to click on it. And that is because we've got a body that is in front of the sketch. So let me kind of illustrate what I mean. If I look at this from the side, you can see that the sketch here, this two-dimensional sketch, it exists back on this back surface. So it is behind this body. And because that sketch is behind the body, it doesn't want to let us choose anything. It doesn't want to let us click on anything that is behind it. So if I want to choose an object, if I want to extrude something that's on this sketch, I need to go over here to my bodies folder, and I need to just hide it. So I can just click on the little eyeball that's right next to this body in my bodies folder. And now that that's hidden, from my create menu I can come down here and choose extrude, and I can pick my shapes that represent my knob. And my knob, once I've got the knob selected, I can turn back on that body. And now I can give my knob a distance, or a distance that I'm going to extrude it. And it's 1 inch thick. Let's make it 3/8 of an inch in thickness. Something that's happening here is our extrusion normally is starting at the plane where our sketch exists, right? And we just kind of illustrated that the sketch exists at the back surface of this front plate that we're making. So we can use an option in our extrude menu. Oh, I just clicked on a whole bunch of stuff and I don't know how I did that. We can choose an option in the extrude menu, extrude window, excuse me, that will let us change the start of that extrusion. So right now the start is defaulting here in my extrude window to the profile plane, so the place where our sketch exists. We can choose, instead of starting that extrusion at the profile plane, we can start it at an offset. And now my front face is 1/4 of an inch, so we should give it a little bit more than 1/4 of an inch. Let's say 1/8 more. So if we make that 0.325 as well, now we're starting our extrusion 1/8 of an inch away from the front plate, from the front of our front cover. If that makes sense. We've got our dial out there floating in space, which is good, believe it or not. And I'm going to go ahead and say OK. Now let's do that same operation to our let's make our dial here. So if I come up here near the top and I'm going to turn off my front cover, and I'm going to zoom in here, and we'll go ahead and grab my extrude tool again, and I'm going to click on each of the bits of that dial that we're going to extrude here. And now I can turn my front cover on again, and now this dial doesn't need to be as thick. This only needs to be, let's say, 1/4 of an inch. Actually, that's probably even too thick for a dial indicator, just making it 1/8 of an inch. And now this same operation here again, instead of starting it at the profile plane, I'm going to start it at an offset from that plane of 3/8 of an inch, so 0.325. We'll make that dial indicator just float 1/8 of an inch off of our front here. And then I'm going to say, making that a new body, and we'll say OK. Now, the final, maybe not the final thing I want to do, but something that I want to do is I need to connect my dial indicator to the gear that's associated with our dial. And we're going to do that with that one last extrusion. Gosh, I think we could join things together like this, so this will be an experiment. I'm going to turn off my front cover again, and I'm going to grab my extrude option here, and I'm just going to choose that inside 1/4 of an inch circle. pretty sure that is not at the same spot. Yeah, so we're going to learn one more option here in our extrude window, because I want to extrude this center shaft out so it both touches our dial and connects it to our gear that we have back here. So if I choose, instead of extruding this in a single direction, I can extrude this in two sides. So if I come out the front here far enough that it will touch our dial there, and I come to the back far enough that it touches our gear, and now the default here is defaulting to cut because I'm moving into these two bodies and it thinks I want to cut away from them. But actually, I want to use this operation. Oh, I wonder if it's not going to let me do this. I want to use this operation to join them together. So if I choose that, change that operation to join, did it indeed do that? Sure didn't. So I was hoping it would just join this body to my helical gear body. It did not. And I guess that's not super surprising. The reason it did not is because my helical gear body exists inside of my helical gear component. My dial indicator, let's go ahead and name that right now so I'm not indicator. Alright, so my dial, my indicator here lives inside of my front body. So what I think I'm going to do here is, I'm pretty sure that I can just take this indicator body, and if I drag this into my helical gear component into the bodies folder, yeah, that worked. So now my indicator here is inside of this helical gear component. So now when I go in 3D print this, I'll just, print this whole component here, and it will have those items attached to each other. So that's very convenient. Now the last thing we need to do here before the end of class, which always sneaks up on me no matter how far ahead I think I am, it always tends to sneak up on me, is we need the special hole in the back of our knob here. And by special hole, I mean the shape that we drew that represents the funny shape that you get in the end of a potentiometer, where it's got a little flat spot in it. So basically we need to draw, or tell you what, let's do this. We've got this geometry that existed here, and we've been using the project tool. So let's go ahead and use the project tool to solve our problem here. So the way we'll do that is I'm going to spin so I can see the back of our knob here, and I'm going to make sure I'm on the front component when I come up here to my Create menu and choose Create Sketch. Now I'm going to create this sketch on the back side of my knob. So if I click on the knob backside there, it's going to spin me around, so I'm kind of looking through my radio. And now I can click on the Create menu and then choose that Project option that we've done a couple of times in this class here now today. I'm going to project the specified entity selection filter of just that circle and that line right there, which are the weird shape of our potentiometer that we drew a couple weeks ago. And now I can finish that sketch. I'm going to name it Pot Shape, which might be a terrible name for it, but it's better than Sketch 2. And this is our Knob. And now all I have to do is extrude that sketch. So if I come up here to my Create menu and then choose this Extrude option, I can just extrude that in like 1/4 of an inch or so. It's 3/8 of an inch thick, so 1/4 of an inch will hopefully be plenty. And I can say OK. And now I'll go ahead and I'll hide my sketches. I'll turn back on my front cover, and just so I can see the rest of my radio, I'll come up here and make that my active component. So the last thing that I kind of want to do in this class here in the last like 3 minutes we got is just to kind of show you. I tend to do this outside of class, and maybe that's less than helpful. So I've got right now when you draw stuff, you get this lovely gray tone, which is great if you're like drawing one part. However, if you are going to illustrate more than one part, it might be helpful to have colors and texture so you can see them apart, tell them apart. And the way that we add colors and textures to the models that we draw are up here in the Modify menu. If we just choose Modify, and then Appearance is what we want here. So if we choose this Appearance option, there are all these different choices that we have here. If I scroll down, so here is some various woods. You can have finished or unfinished. Solid means it's a little bit more of a complicated texture, so it's not going to apply the same texture to all sides of this. It's kind of going to give you the impression of like end grain on the end grain. But if I just choose, gosh, I'm pretty sure this is all, what is it? Ash. So here's an ash semi-gloss. You just have to drag this out over your model. You can either hover over the model in the drawing space, or you can hover over the model in the browser here, and you can drop that right on top of it. There's a plastic menu here. And now if I just take this ABS white and I drag it over my dial here, it's going to go ahead and make my dial white. However, if I didn't want that dial to be white, this icon up here, I can double click on it, and now it gives me this nice little color wheel feature here. So I can make this a black dial just by dragging that down. Now I'm going to want to change this from white to black here, just so I don't get confused by the naming. And then I can say done. And if I wanted to, I could make a red version of this plastic just by right clicking on that black ABS that I just made and saying duplicate. And now if I double click on that, for example, I could make it a nice bright red color. And we'll change that to red. And now I can drag that over you. And there we go. So that's how you kind of change the colors of your object here. I'm just looking to see if I can turn off any sketches, make it a little easier to read. I suppose you could add some text on the outside here that would tell you where your dial's pointing at or what volume level it is. But I'll leave you guys to explore that on your own, or you know, ask me in a future class, and I will 100% answer that question. So that's our radio for you guys drawing at home. That is the end of our radio project. And next week we're due a couple of in December we're going to do a couple of single class projects. So these will be more beginner friendly. We've got some new people, so that's great. I appreciate when we get new people. So we're going to do a couple of little more beginner-friendly projects. That being some Christmas ornaments. So I'm thinking we'll do Christmas ornaments in a couple of different ways. Maybe we'll do a 3D printable Christmas ornament, and maybe we'll do like a CNC'd Christmas ornament, just because I've got a request for that the CNC features, going over the CNC features in Fusion. So and it'll be a couple of nice single project classes, so you can just pop in and join us for one and then have something to show off for it, as opposed to having to go through 5 classes of listening to me talk for 5 entire hours while we draw a radio. Cool. So if there are no questions from the peanut gallery, then we'll bring this to a close. Thanks for joining me. Hope we see you next week.
Thanks, Carl.
Yeah. We'll see you next week, guys.